Welcome to Surrender School. This is the science of Step 1. All right, so I'm going to start like I always start, with my caveats and disclaimers. I am not a medical doctor, a scientist, or expert in the science of obesity and addiction. I am not saying that my way is the right or best way to approach abstinence or food plans. And always, always, always check with your doctor before doing anything different with your food plan. Okay, so last session, we talked about the starvation response. Now, this response in our brains and our bodies unleashes this powerful set of biological and psychological responses that work together and work together very well to make us eat and regain any of the weight that we've lost. It's a very unpleasant part of our physical allergy. And we also talked about some possible ways to cope with it. So are there any questions on last session before we get started on today's topic? If there is, then Cher can let me know. I'm going to keep going. We have a lot to cover today, guys. So I'll apologize for that first thing. All right. We are going to talk about the mental obsession today. These observations would be academic and pointless if our friend never took the first drink, thereby setting the terrible cycle in motion. Therefore, the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than his body. That quote's from the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book, page 23. So over the past 2 sessions, we have explored the science behind the physical allergy part of our disease. We saw how the cycle of insulin resistance and leptin resistance drives the phenomenon of craving, overeating, and fat storage. We also saw how the starvation response compels us back into eating, particularly after we've been abstinent for a while and have actually lost some weight. And it does this by increasing the secretion of hunger hormones and decreasing the secretion of satiety, or the hormones that make us feel full. And this is the worst part of it, it makes us feel like crap until we do eat. Now, over the next 2 sessions, we're going to explore the mental obsession part of our disease. So food addiction and compulsive overeating has a physical allergy and a mental obsession. We've covered the physical allergy. Now we're going to start on the mental obsession. And for me, that mental obsession, the hallmark of it for me is that crazy, incessant food chatter in my head that goes on and will not shut up, okay? And we're also going to take a look at that strange mental blank spot that's talked about in the big book that results in us picking up the food again. So please remember that the physical allergy and the mental obsession work together, just like everything we've been talking about. That's what makes this disease so cunning, baffling, and powerful. It's all going on at the same time. So the mental obsession has always been the most baffling part of my disease, the one that I understood the least. Why did I eat when I didn't want to? Why did I always choose my binge foods over more healthy foods? Why did it feel so good while I was eating when it felt so awful after I was finished? Why did it feel so awful when I was abstaining? Why can't I talk myself out of binging? I have really good reasons not to binge. Why don't they seem to matter to me in the moment? Why do I always want more food? Why am I never satisfied by regular portion sizes? And why am I so oversensitive all the time? Why does this oversensitivity always drive me back into the food. So the short answer to all of these questions is twofold. First, dopamine and the reward circuitry in the brain. And second, how the brain makes decisions about food. We are going to look at both of these things today. Like I said, we've got a lot, so I'm going to try and go, but not too fast, okay? Men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. We like the way we feel while we're eating, not afterwards, but while we're eating, it's an effect, and we feel that wonderful feeling of okayness, of I'm going to be okay, it's going to be okay, I can relax now, I don't have to pay attention to what's going on in the world, okay? And there's a biological or biochemical basis for that. Nature has a very well-defined plan for how things work. The goal of the design is the same for all of life on the planet. It's to survive and to reproduce. That's as complicated as it gets. Nature does this by making you feel good, by giving you a chemical reward when you do something that increases your likelihood of surviving, like eating. In nature, when something feels good, it is good. Feeling good is nature's way of guiding animals toward behaviors that increase their likelihood of survival and reproduction. That's why eating feels good. That's why having sex feels good, because it helps with the goals of nature. And that's the only goals, surviving and reproducing. I have a lot more goals than that, but that's nature's goals. Our brains naturally seek pleasure to feel good. We naturally seek this chemical reward. It is a natural thing. Any act that produces a chemical reward will be learned and repeated. This learning operates completely outside of our conscious awareness. So it's not like we're learning, our times tables. It all happens below our awareness again. Science has found that obese people are more sensitive to the impact of the chemical reward of food. We get a bigger chemical reward from food than non-addicts do. We get a much bigger bang for our buck with food. Now, from the perspective of the chemical reward of food, there is no more rewarding food environment than our modern food environment. We are surrounded by and drowning in opportunities to score a pleasurable food reward, opportunities to get our fix. So think about it like this. Say you're a heroin addict. Your typical day in the modern environment would look something like this. You get into your car in the morning to go to work, and you drive by multiple drive-through heroin places. Do you go through a drive-through and get some? Next, you arrive at work only to find that someone has brought in a batch of fresh heroin and put it in the break room. Do you have any? You sit down and you start working. Then you get an email informing you that your boss is bringing in heroin for lunch as a reward for jobs well done. Do you have any? Later in the afternoon, you have to go speak to a coworker that you're doing a project together with. So you go to that person's office only to find a dish of heroin on her desk. Do you grab a piece? At the end of the day, you drive home past all of the heroin drive-throughs and you arrive home. Did you stop anywhere? Your spouse says he's really in the mood for some takeout heroin. Do you order anything? Then you sit down to watch some TV, only to be bombarded by heroin commercials all night long. Is it any wonder why we have trouble getting through the day abstinently? Because this is what life is like for a food addict in our modern food environment. So let's take a step back and take a look at how our brains actually evolved to eat. The parts of our brains that make decisions about eating food developed around 560 million years ago, long before humans showed up. We've only been around about 250,000 years. So why is this important? Because it tells us right away that the parts of our brains responsible for making decisions about food are very old, very primitive, and very unconscious. That's why we can't logic our way out of our food addiction and overeating. Logic and conscious, rational thinking behavior have nothing to do with our eating behavior. You think you have conscious control over your eating, but your brain is very good at giving you that impression. We saw in sessions 2 and 3 how hormones play a significant and non-conscious role in our overeating and binging behavior. Well, our brain's reward system also plays a powerful and non-conscious role as well. So let's take a look at how our brains decide to eat. This is the striatum in the brain. The striatum is in the basal ganglia and is the actual decision maker with regard to eating behavior. This primitive, non-conscious part of our brains makes the decision that we are going to eat, despite our desperate conscious desire not to. Now remember, this brain technology is 560 million years old. So here's how it works. Our striatum is deep in the middle of our brains. Since it is the decision maker, all of the other non-conscious regions of our brain are constantly whispering to the striatum to get what they want. I'm hot, cool me down. I'm cold, heat me up. I'm thirsty, drink something. I'm horny, get me sex. I'm hungry, eat. The striatum always says no to these whispers by default. But when the whispers become a shout, then the striatum will decide to do the behavior. The striatum makes the decision and then sends signals to the prefrontal cortex, that thinking, conscious part of our brain, to make the behavior, whatever it is, happen. So we only become consciously aware of the decision to eat after it has already been made. Then our prefrontal cortex takes the order to eat and starts making justifications and rationalizations and decisions about where to get the food and why we're going to get the food, and we'll start Monday and one won't hurt, and the whole thing that our prefrontal cortex does to play out the decision to eat that has already been made. So all of this is done below our conscious level of awareness. We are not aware of the decision to eat until after it has already been made. Okay, so how do these whispers become a shout? Now, the striatum, that deep part of our brain, takes cues from 3 different sources. There's internal information, which is the information that's going on in our body. There is external information, what's going on in our immediate environment. And there is prior experience or previous learning. And again, this learning is not conscious learning. This is previous non-conscious learning. So those are the 3 sources. So now here's my understanding, my paltry understanding of how this works for our eating behavior specifically. First, there's the leptin resistance, which leads our brain to believe we're starving, that we don't have enough fat stores for our survival. That's one whisper to the striatum. It's an internal body source of information. Then, because of insulin resistance, our lipostats are set to a higher level of fat. So our brains want us to keep eating so that we can have that higher level of fat on us. That's another whisper. Again, it's an internal source whisper. Then, because of the way I have damaged my dopamine reward system, and we'll go over this in a little bit, I feel awful and that everything is not okay. The brain knows from experience that eating our binge foods makes us feel better. We get that chemical reward and we feel better. That's another whisper to the striatum. And that's a personal experience or learned experience response. Again, not conscious, it's unconscious. Then, if you've lost a little bit of weight, now your brain not only thinks it's starving, but you're actually losing weight. And this is a freaking emergency catastrophe. That's another internal source of information to our striatum. And it's probably a really big, loud internal source, probably louder than just a whisper. Now, together, all of these whispers that I've talked about so far are yelling really loudly. You take this and then add in all of the external food cues we have in our environment, all the candy dishes, all the drive-thrus, all the boxes and bags in the cupboards, all the food porn commercials. All of these are external environment whispers to your striatum. Now you have a very loud shout going, and your striatum pulls the trigger on the decision to eat and sends that decision up to your conscious thinking prefrontal cortex part of your brain. And before you know it, you're eating McDonald's French fries and a pint of ice cream in your car in some random parking lot. That's the way the decision to eat is made, very non-consciously. And because this decision went through our conscious prefrontal cortex, we believe that our binge was our conscious choice, that we made the conscious decision to binge, but we didn't. We were only following orders. And this is where we have traditionally put our personal responsibility as far as not eating our binge foods. We put it here after the decision to eat has already been made. And this is why we fail so much. We are putting our personal responsibility in the wrong place. I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Shortly afterward, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way and I had taken it. Was I crazy? That's from page 5 in the big book. I believe what we just went through is the biological explanation of our strange mental blank spot that they talk about in the big book. That this is the strange mental blank spot for food addicts and compulsive overeaters. So you can see why it is so freaking important to set yourself up for success with regard to abstinence and your food plan. If you are trying to stop overeating and binging after the decision has been made in your striatum, then you will lose. So are there any questions on this part, like how the brain makes a decision to eat and the strange mental blank spot? We're going to talk about ways of coping with this stuff at the end, toward the end. Let's take a closer look at how our brains and bodies evolved to eat. What is this mechanism? How did this mechanism evolve for us? Natural selection gradually crafted our brains to seek as much food as possible with as little effort as possible. In other words, the highest number of calories for the least amount of work. Human brains are especially tuned in to convenience. How many net calories am I going to get from this food, and how convenient is it to get it? Our brain regions that compute food value and determine our motivations to eat are stuck back in the Stone Age when we were hunter-gatherers and lived with frequent food scarcity. There are very few groups of true hunter-gatherers left on the planet. Like this is the Hadza in Tanzania. There is a small group of people that still live the way that our brains actually evolved to live with regard to food. And they have been studied extensively to try and figure out why we are in such desperate straits with our obesity epidemic. So let's take a look at what they teach us about how our brains evolved to handle food and eating. Hunter-gatherers do not understand the idea of moderation or portion control. They work really hard to eat the maximum number of calories possible. They eat everything they can get their hands on. Our brains evolved to seek foods that deliver the most calories per bite. The human brain is extremely preoccupied with calories. We've been wired by evolution to value high-calorie foods above all others. The human brain interprets calorie-dense foods as highly desirable. I had an occasion where I got to listen to an interview with a chief of a hunter-gatherer tribe. I think it was down in the Amazon in Peru, and his son. And they were asking him all these questions that Western civilization is so concerned about, like, what does it mean to be successful? What does it mean to be a successful leader? You know, what does it mean to be satisfied with your life? All these highfalutin questions. And his answer to almost every single one of those questions was meat and honey. Meat and honey. Because in his environment, those were the two most calorie-dense foods that they are able to find and consume. And those were his definition of success, because that ensured his own survival and the survival of his people. And I thought that was fascinating. Meat and honey. I thought that was really interesting. Okay. Humans evolved to prefer the following food qualities: high calorie density, fat, carbohydrate, protein, sweet flavor, salty flavor, and meaty flavor, which is called umami, is the foodie word to use for meaty flavor. These food properties shape our eating behavior by causing dopamine to spike in our brains. This is the chemical reward I was talking about earlier. Food triggers dopamine release in our striatum, just like drugs of abuse. The more concentrated the foods are, processed, extracted, highly refined, the more dopamine they release. You get a lot more dopamine with a donut than you do with a stalk of broccoli. The more dopamine they release into the striatum, the more driven we are to seek these foods out. And all of this happens non-consciously. So the non-conscious parts of our brain perceive certain foods as so valuable that they drive us to seek and eat them, even if we aren't hungry, and even in the face of a sincere and often desperate desire not to eat them. So if all of this is true, why do hunter-gatherers like the Hadza stay lean? They stay lean because they eat fewer calories overall, period. Their binges, when food is actually available, are balanced by times when they eat very little simply because they can't find enough food. So what does all this mean? It means that overeating and binging is actually good for them. It is a healthy thing to do when possible because it's not always possible. So for most of human history, our instinctive drives to eat as much food as possible were completely in our best interests. It gave us our best chance at survival. So while a calorie-seeking brain is an asset, when calories are hard to come by, it is a huge liability when you're drowning in food, when you live in the kind of 24/7 food-rich environment that we do. This is called an evolutionary mismatch. This is a situation where once useful traits become harmful when they are dragged into an unfamiliar environment, an environment that the trait was not evolved for. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, hunter-gatherers remain lean because they're a lot more active than a sedentary Westerner. And that's true. The Hadza typically walk about 7 to 10 miles a day in search of food. But, and they've done the studies on this, they burn about the same number of calories a day as a mostly sedentary Westerner. Now remember, from the past 2 sessions, the body is really good at adjusting metabolic rate to conserve energy, both while at rest and while active. The body is really good at toning down the actual number of calories you burn. That's why they don't burn any more calories than we do sitting in an office all day. Now, there are a ton of excellent reasons to exercise, a ton of them, and we'll go over some of them in a later session, but weight loss is not one of them, okay? And the Hadza are a perfect example of why not, because our body will downregulate the calories that we burn. So are there any questions on this kind of way that our brains have evolved to eat and how we are in an environmental mismatch, an evolutionary mismatch?
No questions right now.
Okay. I'm overwhelming you guys, aren't I? Okay, here we go. Our brains evolved to eat food with 3 main characteristics: a limited variety, unconcentrated, and minimally processed. And we're going to look at these food characteristics one at a time. First, we evolved to eat a limited variety of foods. We are now faced with almost 40,000 food items in the typical grocery store. Who needs this many different varieties of Oreos? Definitely not us. Food variety has a very powerful influence on our calorie intake. The more variety we encounter at a meal, the more we eat. And scientists have a name for it, and it's called the buffet effect. It's why we always have room for dessert. Now, there's something called sensory-specific satiety, and this is where we can eat our fill of one type of food and actually feel full. And then when we are presented with a different kind of food, we can eat still more. This explains why we can eat dessert after we are stuffed. Remember that commercial? If you're of a certain age, you remember that commercial where they said, there's always room for Jell-O. You remember that commercial? Yeah. That's why buffets and potlucks have such a binge potential, because there are so many different foods available for us to eat. We also evolved to eat unconcentrated foods. So here's sugar beets, and here's the sugar made from the sugar beets. Food was eaten in a much less calorie dense, less refined, and much less rewarding chemically rewarding state. Now, I wouldn't chow down on sugar beets, but I will mainline sugar coming from sugar beets. Modern food is super concentrated. And then not only that, but then we make these incredible concoctions of all of these super concentrated foods to make things like French fries, donuts, cakes, candy. It's crazy. Like a perfect example of this is when I was traveling in Peru once, I was doing a tour of the Altiplano, the mountainous regions of Peru. And we would drink, every day, we would drink some coca tea made from coca leaves. And that was to help us with the altitude and to prevent altitude sickness. And it was kind of like drinking a cup of coffee. And now it was fine. It was delicious. I left Peru and never thought about it again. You take those coca leaves and you concentrate them and you process them and you refine them and you make them into cocaine or crack, then you've got a problem. And that's what we have done with our food sources. And unfortunately, we are the ones most susceptible to that. Food addicts are the most susceptible. We also evolved to eat food that was only very minimally processed. So our ancestors ate food either raw or they threw it on the fire. That was it. No fancy cooking, no fancy processing. But unfortunately, most of the modern food we eat is so processed that you cannot even pronounce all of the ingredients that are in it. It's that mangled. I would say mangled. Modern food technology, and make no mistake, modern food technology is a science. It is a science, and they scientifically manipulate food to make it the most appealing it can get. It maximizes the rewarding qualities of food, making it far more seductive to our brains than ever before in human history. We now have extremely calorie-dense, carefully engineered combinations of sugar, fat, salt, and starch that would have been inconceivable to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Many of these modern foods cause a larger release of our reward chemicals than the human brain ever evolved to expect, leading to addiction in susceptible people. And remember, we are susceptible because of the way our brains find food way more rewarding than non-addicts. That's just the way we're made. Modern, highly palatable foods are calorie-dense, easily digestible, and highly concentrated in form. Think ice cream, French fries, candy, chocolate, bacon. Bacon is the gateway food. Our brains label these foods as highly rewarding and so valuable that it keeps us eating them even when we don't want to. So from a science standpoint, what gives us this good feeling, this feeling of pleasure, this feeling of reward? The pleasure or good feeling we get, our effect, like the big book talks about, comes from what's called the reward circuit in the brain. This circuit is located in the basal ganglia of our brain. Numerous neurotransmitters are involved in this reward pathway. Now, neurotransmitters are simply chemical messengers that make things happen in our body. The best known and researched neurotransmitter in the reward system in the brain is dopamine. But there are also other neurotransmitters that play a part in all of this for us, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. The main way this reward circuit works is that the neurotransmitter dopamine is secreted by the ventral tegmental area, this little blue area right here. And the dopamine moves to the nucleus accumbens right here. Then up to the prefrontal cortex right here to where we make our rationalizations and justifications for why we're going to McDonald's right now when we've been abstinent for a week and we want to keep being abstinent. So in other words, this whole process, the dopamine release from the ventral tegmental area up to the nucleus accumbens, up to the prefrontal cortex, is the way our brain gets us to eat, okay? At the same time, the other pleasure chemicals are released and we get that wonderful feeling. The more alcoholic food we eat, the more dopamine gets released. As food addicts, we are constantly flooding our brains with dopamine and other feel-good chemicals. Because of this constant flooding of dopamine in our brain caused by our binging and our overeating, our brain receptors for dopamine downregulate or thin out. This is due to a process called homeostasis. Our brains are just trying to figure out how to deal with this ocean of dopamine constantly flooding them. And if this process sounds familiar, it's because it is. This is how we become insulin resistant. Our bodies are just trying to figure out how not to be overwhelmed by all of this dopamine flooding our brain. It's the same process as with insulin. So, due to this downregulation of dopamine receptors in our brains, we get less and less of an effect from our binge foods. This means that we have to eat even more of our alcoholic foods to get any effect. This is the process of tolerance, and it works the same for food as it does for heroin. This is why it seems like after a while, nothing can ever scratch that itch we have. So another reason, in addition to the starvation response we talked about last time, that we can't stay stopped after a period of abstinence is because life, when we are not getting our effect, feels bleak and awful. There is a general and overwhelming feeling of not okay and need more. As the big book puts it, we are restless, irritable, and discontent until we can again experience the sense of ease and comfort which comes at once by eating a few bites of alcoholic food. Now, do you want the good news or the bad news first? I'm going to give you the good news first. The good news is that our dopamine receptors will regenerate. Our brains can heal themselves. Now for the bad news. It takes months, and I mean months. Some sources said up to 18 months without any ingestion of our alcoholic foods, so no dopamine flooding. Repeated slips into alcoholic foods provide the brain with what's called intermittent interval reinforcement. Now, intermittent interval reinforcement is the delivery of a reward at irregular, unpredictable intervals, random, sporadic dopamine flooding. This method of reinforcement has been shown to produce the greatest amount of effort to obtain that reward. So when you give your brain an occasional donut, an occasional binge day, an occasional cheat day, your brain is going to redouble its efforts to get you to eat. And this is why we will go out at 2 a.m. in a snowstorm to get our binge food. No amount of effort is too much effort in order to get our fix. So put another way, if we give our dopamine reward system a fix of our alcoholic foods occasionally, our brains will constantly, and I mean constantly, hound us to get us to eat again. It is important to recognize that when the dopamine receptors have healed in our brains, and we are eating abstinent foods, we are still going to be getting a normal reward from our brain when we eat. It will be pleasant, it will be enjoyable, but we will not get that really intense effect that we get from our binge foods. Now, this to me is when the mental obsession is the trickiest. I've healed my reward system. I'm eating abstinently, and then wham, I am metaphorically punched in the face by life. Life gets lifey. Something happens with my job, my spouse, my kids, whatever. I feel awful. So now what do I do? The only thing my brain, not my conscious brain, my non-conscious brain knows to do to make itself feel better is to eat my alcoholic foods. It is always the first suggestion my brain makes to me. Technically, dopamine itself does not produce our feelings of pleasure. There are euphoric transmitters called endorphins, and they are secreted at the same time as dopamine. And they are actually what cause our feelings of pleasure. They activate our body's natural opiate receptors. They relieve stress and create a feeling of well-being, that feeling. Most researchers believe that dopamine is the chemical that actually teaches our brain what feels good. It teaches our brain how to get that chemical reward. Dopamine helps our brain learn that binging on our alcoholic foods makes us feel really good. Dopamine helps our brain connect the dots between eating our alcoholic foods and feeling pleasure and relief. And this learning operates completely outside of our conscious awareness. The more concentrated our binge foods are, the more dopamine they release, along with the other feel-good chemicals. And our brains learn that overeating and binging on these foods makes us feel really good. Unfortunately, unlike our ancestors, using good feelings or pleasure as a way to guide human behavior doesn't work very well in our modern environment. Our brains are pleasure-seeking missiles, and modern foods are really, really, really good at giving us that pleasure. Now, all you really need to know about dopamine and the reward center is that food triggers dopamine release, just like drugs of abuse. That dopamine isn't really responsible for our effect, our sense of pleasure and relief. The endorphins that are secreted at the same time as dopamine are the chemicals that give us our effect. And dopamine is what teaches our brain how to get our effect. It teaches us that eating our binge foods, our alcoholic foods, give us our fix, our effect. That's all you need to know about dopamine. Are there any questions yet?
Nope, we're good.
Okay. All right. So what are we going to do about all of this? I mean, it sounds so overwhelming. I structure my food plan to fit how my brain evolved to handle food and eating. So the first thing that I do is I keep my food plan as simple as possible. No complicated creations. My food is enjoyable, but it's not exciting and it's not sexy. I don't go quite as far as eating purely hunter-gatherer style, but my food is very, very simple. Here's a way you can test the simplicity of your food plan. When you are grocery shopping, is there anything in your cart that you're really excited about? Anything that you cannot wait to get home and eat? If so, that food is too exciting for you. You can use the same test for eating in a restaurant. Are you excited about eating in the restaurant? Can't wait to get there. Can't wait to look at the menu. Are you looking forward to the food more than you are looking forward to spending time with your friends? If so, that restaurant is not for you. I also don't eat food in concentrated forms. I eat fruit, not fruit juice. Whole grains, not flour made from the whole grains. I don't eat any concentrated sweet flavors, salty flavors, or meaty umami flavors. So nothing that has been processed to make it more enticing. I eat unprocessed food, no middle of the grocery store items, no substitute foods for my typical binge foods like light versions of anything like flourless cookies or cauliflower pizza crusts. I don't eat any of those kinds of fake foods or analog foods. I also want to recognize all of the ingredients in the food that I eat. I want to be able to pronounce everything that I'm eating. I avoid eat all you want situations. I don't present myself with a lot of options to eat. And I know they say variety is the spice of life, but not when it comes to an abstinent food plan. I avoid buffets, cafeterias, and potlucks. Particularly, I did this early in my abstinence. I still avoid buffets. When I go to a potluck or dinner party, I typically bring my own, well, for a potluck, I always bring my own food. And sometimes at a dinner party, I will also bring my own food. That way, I am 100% sure of getting an abstinent meal, and I don't have to stand in front of a mountain of food, 99% of it non-abstinent, and try to make good abstinent choices. That is expecting my body and brain to do something they were not built to do. I control my environment with regard to food cues as much as I can. I make it so that I don't have to constantly make the decision of whether to eat or not, because if I do that, I will lose. We know that we are much more biochemically susceptible to overeating in an environment loaded with highly rewarding foods. Stay out of slippery places like the candy and snack aisle, fast food joints, and old binge haunts. I don't expect myself to go into Macayo's, a prominent Mexican food restaurant here in town, and pick an abstinent meal, because that was one of my major binge food restaurants. I just don't expect that of myself. That means I'm in denial if I think I'm going to be able to do that. I may be able to do it once. I may be able to do it twice, but I will not be able to do it routinely, and I will eventually relapse. I don't make or provide non-abstinent food for other people. I don't bring junk food into the house for other people. And if family members demand to bring that stuff into the house, it is out of sight in a cupboard I never, ever go into, ever. I don't watch commercials when watching TV. I figure out what my vulnerabilities are, and then I figure out a way around them, a way to set myself up for success, a way to anticipate problems and do things to ward off the problems. I make my food life as routine as possible. I want to decrease the number of decisions I have to make about food. I basically eat the same things every day. I just switch up the kinds of fruits, the kinds of veggies, the kinds of proteins in my dishes. When I go to restaurants, I try to go to very familiar ones where I know what I am going to order without looking at the menu. And if I have to go to an unfamiliar restaurant, I look up their menu online before I go and choose what I am going to order ahead of time. I want to minimize exposing my brain to food cues as much as possible. I give my brain other options to feel good. Reward is not bad. We need it to live. It's very important for, getting out of bed in the morning. If we try and live without basic brain reward, we will become suicidal. There was, and I don't know if I've said this in another session, but there was a drug in the early 2000s that came out called rimonabant. And it was a weight loss drug, and it worked by shutting off the reward system. So there was no reward for eating. But what happened is people started committing suicide because life without reward is not worth living. So normal reward is healthy and good and beneficial. But what we've been getting from our alcoholic foods is not. It's not normal, it's not healthy, and it's not beneficial. So I tried to figure out some ways to give myself healthy rewards. So I had physical feel-good methods like massages, hot baths, foot rubs, naps. I came up with social connection rewards, like formulating my God Squad and having interactions with them. Outreach calls, meetings, those all give you a nice, pleasurable reward in your brain. I developed some spiritual connection rewards. I did this through meditation, relaxation, prayer, step work, and emotional sobriety work. I make my abstinence and my food plan and my recovery a bit of a game. And I created a reward system for it. Now, this has really worked well for me. I am basically a higher level lab rat. I created a reward system for myself for maintaining abstinence when I first became abstinent. I got myself a wooden box and I wrote little rewards, not a lot of money, but little rewards on little slips of paper. And for every week that I was abstinent, I got to pull out a little slip of paper that had like a reward on it, like a new fingernail polish or a new kind of lipstick, or going out and buying a book, or watching a favorite movie that I've watched 17 million times. So those were little rewards I could give myself. And each time I did it, I got a nice little reward in my brain. Nothing overwhelming, no flooding, no dopamine flooding. I also developed an emergency plan, and the best time to develop an emergency plan is before you have an emergency. Do this before you need it. Have one in place that you can use when you start getting the RIDS, the restless, irritable, and discontent. These plans are extremely individual. They have to work for you. So for me, when I am in an emergency situation, I go directly to my higher power in prayer and meditation, and I journal. And then I ask my higher power for help in accepting reality for whatever is making me upset. And I ask for guidance to make the best of the situation, whatever it is. And that's my emergency plan. If I'm still in an emergency, after I've done that, I will call someone from my God Squad. I will touch base with someone from my God Squad. Some people, exercise. Some people immediately make a call, but that's not me. I'm a little introverted. But you have to have an emergency plan that works for you. And you may have to experiment in order to figure out what really works for you. Another thing I do is I observe my own mind. I talk myself through the feelings I'm having. I ask my higher power to help me explain to myself that these feelings and food thoughts are just the mental obsession part of the disease. I develop what they call in 12-step meetings that pause between the stimulus and the response, between the food thought and eating. I have this pause, and that's where I meet my higher power, in that pause. And I develop that by learning to observe my own mind, by learning to observe my thoughts, observe my emotions, because my thoughts and my emotions are not necessarily fact. And I need that pause in my higher power to help me see clearer. I also made a big philosophical shift about the role of food in my life. I view food as medicine. I heal my body with it, and I take my medicine 3 times a day. I do not use food for recreation, entertainment, celebration, holidays, relaxation, or as a pick-me-up. I really have to take 100% responsibility for my abstinence in all food situations, because non-addicts use food for all of these reasons all of the time. And if I just go along with what everyone else is doing, I will wind up eating foods that light up my reward circuitry, and my disease will take over. And before you know it, I will be in full-blown relapse. I also don't use food as a way to manage emotional or physical discomfort. Even when I was active in my disease, even when I was in despair about having relapsed again, all my brain knew how to do was to lead me back to the refrigerator to eat more, to feel better. That's all it knew how to do. And I had to learn some other things to do to manage emotional and physical discomfort. So next week, we are going to explore part 2 of the mental obsession. And that's the biochemistry of stress and the hormone cortisol, and how they drive us to unconsciously eat.
The question is, does dopamine flooding occur with compulsions such as shopping, watching too much Netflix, and so forth?
Yes, that dopamine flooding is what happens when what would normally be rewarding is way overblown. So sex is rewarding. Porn is dopamine flooding. Having enough is rewarding. Shopping for all this kinds of crap is dopamine flooding. So it's the way it's the way that our brain rewards us has been hijacked by these ultra concentrated things in our environment. It's not just food, it's a lot of other stuff. We have a 12-step program for all of them.
So if the striatum continues to tell us to eat, and we don't have a choice in that, at what point does it stop doing that? Otherwise, we would never reach recovery, because it would always be yelling at us.
Right. So all of those different inputs that I talked about, the internal body systems, the environment, and our previous learning, all of those come into play in normalizing the striatum's decision to eat. So we talked about when we re-regulate our insulin and leptin so that our body doesn't think we're starving, our lipostat comes down to a more normal level of fat. It's not sending an alarm to the striatum. When we take care of the physical allergy through abstinence and a food plan, then that helps the brain heal. And not only for the dopamine and the reward system, but it's also not sending out these panicky internal messages to the striatum. And that's also why it's important to take care of your food environment, the environment that you're surrounded with regard to food, because that's also a source to eat more. Okay, so that's how you take care of it. The previous learning is the previous learning. I don't know how. I mean, that's why occasionally still the my brain will suggest, oh, you're not feeling great right now? Eat. It still will suggest that to me, but I have a whole other, it's not a strong thought. And I have a whole lot of other stuff in place to help me with that.
And so the next question actually ties to that. And it says, what should I do before my brain tells me to eat? So obviously you set yourself up so that it doesn't scream at you, right? So what does she do? This is, I won't tell you who, but anyway, so what do they do? What do we do before the brain tells us to eat?
Okay, so we manage that all with what I just went through, with managing the internal sources of the trigger to eat. So we re-regulate our hormones, and to manage our environment and set ourselves up for success and surround ourselves with other people who are doing the same things. Those are the things that you do. And the question that you're asking, I think that it comes down to is, can I do this without any emotional or physical discomfort? And the answer to that is no. Because it takes time for the body to re-regulate hormonally, takes time for the reward circuitry to heal. So the thing that you have to do, and the things in order to manage that discomfort, is you work your program, you work with a sponsor, you get your God squad, you read spiritual literature, you read program literature, you inundate yourself with recovery podcasts that you listen to. So you constantly are feeding yourself things that support not eating. It doesn't mean you're not going to get there, but there were times early in my abstinence, and I'm talking about probably in the first 30 days, where sometimes when it was going on, none of the other strategies that I had was working. And so I just took a blanket and covered my head with it and sucked my thumb in a corner until enough of that bad feeling passed that I could get up and use some of the other strategies and coping mechanisms that I had for it. I do not know a way of doing abstinence and a food plan while you're losing weight that you can do it painlessly because of everything we've already gone over. It's a biochemical process of healing, and we have to let ourselves do it.
And here's the next question. Is it just binging that causes dopamine flooding, or can just normal eating cause that too?
Normal eating of a cookie is going to produce more dopamine than eating a piece of fruit, than getting sweet flavor from a piece of fruit. Because it is so highly refined and so processed, it will start the process of more. Dopamine will be spat out, secreted. And dopamine has been dubbed the molecule of more. It's going to want more and more and more. So you don't eat the cookie. You eat a piece of fruit, and it's a nice regular level of reward, regular level of dopamine secretion, and you move on with your day. Now, to be fair, there are some people that will get a hyperdopamine response from really particularly sweet fruits. There are some people that can't eat grapes. There are some people that can't eat cherries. There are some people that can't eat mangoes because they are quite sweet. So essentially, the way that they're bodily and mentally different from their fellows is a little bit more than I am. I can eat grapes and cherries. I don't eat them a lot, but I can eat them and not run into a problem. There's a spectrum for us. We need to recognize that there are individual differences when we're talking about the biochemistry and the science of obesity and food addiction. Some of us are more susceptible. That's why abstinences alcoholic foods as well as food plans are different for different people because sometimes we have different susceptibilities in our bodies, but these are overall the general ones that I've talked about.
And I have one more question, and that is, as soon as we stop processed foods, do the dopamine receptors upregulate again at that point in time, or does it take time or whatever?
It takes time, and it can take a lot of time. That had to do with that intermittent interval reinforcement I talked about. We have to not eat our alcoholic binge foods that cause all that flooding for months. It took me about 3 or 4 months for that to clear up. One source, and I can't remember which source it was, I'm sorry, said that it can take up to 18 months of no alcoholic foods before the dopamine system has completely healed.
See you next week.